Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome you all for tonight's lecture entitled, Is This America? Requiem for a Nation Lost, Vision for America Refounded, which will be delivered by Sherrilyn Ifill, this semester's Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitor. And having spent a little time with Sherrilyn, and in light of the subject at hand, I can't think of a more important talk to be held at this particular point. There are many people to welcome, too many to do so, but I just want to say how glad I am that Martin Seifert is here from WilmerHale, and they have been supporting this event for many years now. Now, I am told that there is also a group of students from Norwich University in the great state of Vermont here. Is that true? We don't usually do call-outs like this, but as it happens, my home in the U.S. is on Main Street in Norwich, Vermont, which is not the home of Norwich University anymore, though it was in the 19th century. Before they moved up the road to Northfield. But I am really delighted to welcome you here, and I hope you enjoy the event and tell the folks at home I'm trying to make good. So this is one of those nights when I am not introducing our speaker, but I do want to say a word about the person who this lecture honors. The Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitorship at the American Academy was created in 2008 to honor the legacy of one of the Academy's founding trustees, Lloyd Cutler. Now, every year we recall Lloyd Cutler as one of the great attorneys of his time, the last super lawyer, as The Atlantic called him, someone who co-founded the firm Wilmer Cutler Pickering, later WilmerHale, and he served as White House counsel to Presidents Jimmy Carter and a little more briefly to Bill Clinton, but in hugely important roles. And he also performed important jobs in the administrations of Presidents Johnson, Reagan, and George W. Bush back in the days when bipartisanship was considered a virtue. When Lloyd Cutler passed away in 2005, The Atlantic called him the last super lawyer, a man who had served on so many blue ribbon commissions that if you took all that ribbon, you could circle the earth. As the great legal journalist Stuart Taylor put it, Lloyd was born in eminence grise, in that last generation of people who got to be grown-ups. In this spirit, the Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitorship brings U.S. scholars, legal scholars and practitioners of the highest renown to Berlin for in-depth exchange with German colleagues, counterparts, and the interested public. Former Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitors include Stephen Breyer, former Justice of the Supreme Court, Linda Greenhouse, Appeals Court Justice David Tatel, among many others. But there is another through line here, if you will, that connects Lloyd Cutler with this evening. In the summer of 1963, as things turned very ugly in the American South because of the civil rights movement, President John F. Kennedy summoned 250 leaders of the American bar to the East Room of the White House. And he told those attorneys that they had a special obligation to ensure that civil rights issues were resolved, and I quote, in the courts and not in the streets. And out of that meeting came a new thing called the President's Committee, which was soon renamed the Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights under law. And the many lawyers who wound up volunteering to work for the committee went south and then ultimately fanned out across America to litigate on behalf of those whose rights were being denied on a daily basis. One of those people in the East Room was Lloyd Cutler, and he went on to be one of the early leaders of the Lawyers' Committee, and he argued some of its pivotal cases, including NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, which established the right for Black people to boycott, people who were seeking to fight some of the truly oppressive circumstances in Mississippi. He also went on to appoint as the executive director of the Lawyers Committee a young attorney named David Tatel, who later became one of our truly great appeals court judges, and also as I mentioned, a Lloyd Cutler fellow here just 2 years ago. Sorry, distinguished visitor. The civil rights element in Lloyd Cutler's life doesn't get mentioned nearly as often as the power lawyering, but it was absolutely there, and it connects us directly to our speaker tonight, Sherrilyn Ifill, who we are thrilled to welcome. So now let me play my role as the introducer of the introducer. Anna Rubisam, right here, also a lawyer, will be introducing Sherrilyn very shortly. And I want to thank Anna for being here, for being a terrific friend of the Academy, and especially for connecting us with Sherrilyn and making this visit possible. We benefit enormously from our friends who connect us with the extraordinary people they know. Anna Rubisam is a member of the bar in the state of New York with a law degree from NYU. She specializes in international law and international criminal law. She is a native of the DDR, safe to say, and she has devoted her professional life to building and strengthening the international rule of law. She advises state delegations to the UN, to various international organizations and corporations, and among them, the German delegation to the UN. She clerked at the International Court of Justice in The Hague and participated in the negotiations to create the International Criminal Court. She served as a founding commissioner of the International Nuremberg Principles Academy, an institution built on the legacy of the Nuremberg trials. More recently, Anna helped get the Special Tribunal for Ukraine off the ground. So we are thrilled that she will be introducing Sherrilyn. Now, before I hand the mic over to Anna, I just want to give you a quick preview of the event. Sherrilyn will talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll pepper her with a few questions, and we'll open up for audience Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please do raise your hand, and as always, we will bring you a microphone, and we hope that there will be a question mark at the end of the question. We do ask you to make sure that all the questions are done in the spirit of civil discourse, which we embrace and which we hope will reflect respect for differing perspectives. If you are joining online, you can type your question below the live stream window, and we will do our best to get to it. And now, without further ado, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this very generous introduction, Dan. And thank you for all you do for the Academy. That's really just fantastic institution that we love and came to appreciate so much. And thank you, Jana. I don't see you right now, but I know you're here, and your colleagues so much for putting this together. And special thanks to Anna Ramic, for immediately being on fire and for making sure it works out when we first discussed bringing Sherrilyn here. Anna can't be here tonight, unfortunately, but she's either on live stream or giving birth to her second child. Still the most important thing, followed by civil rights. It was the civil rights movement that brought me an Aussie, and thank you for that note on the DDR, Dan, to America. And so it's a profound honor that I will now get to introduce you, a very special Berlin audience, to the great civil rights leader of our time, Sherrilyn Ifill. The thought of Sherrilyn fills me with hope. And in times like these, I find myself thinking of her almost every day. Sherrilyn was extraordinary from the start, as the 10th of 10 children. She's a New Yorker who dreamt of becoming a civil rights lawyer already at 8 years old. By the time she became the director of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, the legendary civil rights institution once shaped by Thurgood Marshall, she had reached the pinnacle of civil rights lawyering. And under her leadership, Sherrilyn Ifill helped guide the nation through some of its most consequential civil rights battles. Defending voting rights after Shelby County versus Holder had weakened the Voting Rights Act. I'm sorry, I still am German somehow. Shaping the national legal response to racial injustice after the murder of George Floyd, and restoring LDF, the Legal Defense Fund, to the center of the nation's struggle for democracy. Sherrilyn is the rare combination of a brilliant legal mind and a profound moral voice. And when she speaks, she reminds the country that democracy is not self-executing. Democracy depends on courage. Democracy depends on vigilance. And finally, it depends on people willing to insist that the Constitution's promises apply to everyone. Now, as the Vernon E. Jordan Jr. Chair in Civil Rights at Howard University School of Law, she just founded the 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy, a platform that will amplify insisting on that promise. I trust that after listening to her, you will all want to get involved and support Sherrilyn's new center. Sherrilyn also, by the way, has an amazing husband who's here today, 3 kids and 1 grandchild, if you can believe it. And in 2007, she wrote a pivotal book in which she asks, what happens to community when it never publicly confronts its horrific racial violence? This is the book. I need you all of you, to buy it. It's called On the Courthouse Lawn and argues that America cannot achieve racial justice until communities openly confront. Great. These are my backup cards. Because today I was nervous. The book is called On the Courthouse Lawn and argues that America cannot achieve racial justice until communities openly confront the history of lynching and acknowledge the victims whose stories were suppressed. As an Aussie, I relate to this book in more than we do as Americans. I once heard Sherrilyn say in a speech that as a child, she felt like she missed out on the most important time, when the nation first wrested civil rights from its white supremacist past. Well, now is arguably that kind of time again. A time of extreme cruelty. White supremacy is very much alive. Already over 70,000 people are detained in what Jamel Bouie recently argued in the New York Times can properly be called concentration camps in the United States. In this heavy time, full of corrupt cowardice, her willingness to fight with great clarity and deep faith in the nation keeps so many of us from despair. Just in the past year, you could have found her as a highly sought-after university convocation speaker or as a headliner of an event at the MoMA in New York City. I was lucky to be part of that. She won many awards over her career, medals and fellowships from the legal world to the world of pop, from the Brandeis Medal to Time's 100 Most Influential People in 2021. But to me, the essence of it all is that when I listen to Sherrilyn's words, she makes me feel taller and my walk get lighter. I suddenly know that it can be done. Things will get better again, and we can make it so together. That famous Baldwin quote, that the world is held together, really it's held together by the love and passion of a very few people, it used to fill me with dread. Dread that the world hangs by a thread because it comes down to a few people. But now I hear the opposite in those words. The world is able to turn back to good, and it only takes a few people. So with my greatest joy and deepest respect, let me introduce you to one of those few. Sherrilyn Ifill.
Well, it's tough to follow that. It's really beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I thank you, Anne, for that introduction, and you've been really lovely to me and to my family, and including a wonderful dinner party the other night. And I know Anna Ramak is either in labor or watching this, or maybe both, but I want to thank her also for her kindness and for really continuing to follow up to make this all possible for me. And I'm genuinely thrilled to be with you all, to have a chance to talk about the matters that have consumed me for the last 35 years that I've been a civil rights attorney, but most importantly and intensely over the last decade, and that I know, brought you all here tonight. I would be remiss if I didn't also just thank the firm of Wilmer Hale, who I have long admired, and who've done really great work with the organization I led, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, over the years. And I'm a real lawyer's lawyer. So I know some people don't like lawyers. I like lawyers. And but the reason I like law is because the communities of people I represent are people who are often not believed. Things happen to them in their communities, and it's hard to explain to people how these things can have happened. And law, I learned, gave me a way of presenting in an environment that had power and legitimacy the stories of the people that I've been privileged to represent. It was always interesting to me that even when I would lose a case, which would drive me crazy, my clients were making a different evaluation about what winning meant. They would say, "Oh yes, but I will never forget the day when Miss Jones got to testify and everyone had to listen to her." Or when the judge would not let that counsel talk to Mr. Smith in that way. They were hearing their voice, which is really, to me, as a civil rights lawyer, the job. Not for me to talk, but for me to work the rules in such a way that my clients get the chance to sit on that stand and tell their story. And tell it in a way and in an environment in which they must be respected. So I'm very thrilled to be here in the name of Lloyd Cutler. But you're all here because we are in a moment, as they say. And I wish it were just a moment, but it's lasting a bit longer. And I am here because I have learned over the last really 10 years that one of the most important things we can do in times of pressure, particularly anti-democratic pressure, is to come out and see one another. Because this can get very discouraging and very lonely. And even though you've got, your Facebook friends or whatever platform you're on, if you're on any platform, it sometimes feels like unreal that the things that outrage you, the things that move you, the things that seem important to you appear not to be important to tens of millions of your fellow countrymen or to people in the world. So I do a lot of speaking because it's an opportunity for people to come out and see one another and know that there is a powerful and strong element of people in this world who believe in democracy, who believe in truth, who believe in decency, who believe in kindness, who believe in the rule of law, who believe the things that give us the best chance to be our best selves in this world. So this is a privilege for me because I need to see you as well. So I've often said that civil rights lawyers are democracy workers. And I say this because I want you to understand that for me, I have always believed that evaluating whether a democracy is healthy or not is an exercise that must be undertaken by examining how your democracy is working in the lives of those who are most marginalized. All of us in this room are likely the people for whom democracy, whether in Germany or in the United States or wherever you are from, we're the people for whom democracy has worked out. We did okay. We're students, we're lawyers, we're doctors, we're professors, and we're doing okay. So we're the people for whom democracy has worked out, and that makes us particularly ill-equipped to actually critically evaluate the health of our democracy. To evaluate the health of democracy requires that you identify how democracy, a particular democracy, engages with those who are most marginalized, those who are at the bottom, those who encounter democracy in its messiest places, those for whom it's not working out, to tell you the story of what ails your democracy and perhaps lead you to how you can fix it. This is like examining the foundation of a house. You don't determine whether the foundation of a house is strong by going up to the attic. You go down to the basement. You want to know whether the foundation is strong or sound. And the people who encounter the foundations of democracies are the ones who are seeing the cracks and the fissures in the foundation. And the reason why I have felt so privileged to be a civil rights lawyer is that that's what my clients see. They are able to see whether there really is free speech, whether the press is really free and informative, whether they have channels and opportunities, realistic opportunities to vote and participate in the political process, whether they are able to access employment, whether the rule of law is truly applied equally regardless of race or station or ethnicity, and whether the channels of democratic engagement are truly open. And for this reason, I have been warning since the early aughts, and certainly intensely since 2013, well before our current president became a candidate, that the foundation of American democracy was fundamentally and dangerously compromised. I knew that because all around us were the signs of devastating inequality. The middle class was shrinking, income growth and wealth was rapidly expanding for the top 5% of households, and less of the aggregate income fell. The increases in the aggregate income fell for middle and low and income families and grew exponentially for those at the top. In 2007, Jeff Bezos, the owner of the behemoth Amazon, paid no federal income taxes, even as his wealth grew to upwards of $11 billion that year. In 2011, when his wealth was clocked at $18 billion, he actually received a tax credit of $4,000 for his children. George Soros, who I admire greatly, so don't say anything bad about George, paid no federal income tax in 2016, 2017, and 2018. Great philanthropist, but no income tax. But tens of thousands of moderate income Americans struggle to pay their federal income taxes every year. The top 10% of families in the US own 70% of the wealth. The bottom half, only 6% of the country's wealth, and much of that is calculated because of their Social Security benefits. White families own 85% of the wealth in the country. These kinds of disparities are not indicators of healthy democracy. During this period, it was apparent that the scourge of racial violence was on the rise, and particularly police violence and murder of unarmed Black Americans, which probably came mostly to your consciousness in 2020. But it is a phenomenon that has existed for the entirety of the 20th century, is a relic of slavery. And the concept of police departments in the US really came out of the slavery period. And it has continued unabated and even increased in many places in the country. Officers were routinely not held accountable for the most horrifying and grotesque forms of brutality and even murder. My first encounter with this phenomenon was when I was 10 years old, and a white police officer named Michael Shea killed a 10-year-old Black boy named Clifford Glover, who was out on a Saturday morning with his stepdad. The killing took place not far from the neighborhood where I learned this week, where Dawood Bey grew up in Queens, New York. There were countless cases in New York City of these kinds of police killings, officers claiming a young Black man had a gun in his hand when it was a cell phone, claiming that a Black boy looked like a suspect they were looking for, or that the officer feared for his life. By 2014, with the new technology of cell phones, the cold-blooded killing of Black men by law enforcement officers was on display for the entire country to see. I can't breathe. For the first time, many white people began to see the phenomenon that most Black children know by the time they are adolescents, that if you are Black, and especially a man, that the people that we empower with the mantle of law enforcement, who are armed by governments with a baton, pepper spray, a taser, a gun, a shield as a badge of honor, and the right to take life in the name of the citizenry, can kill you for no reason whatsoever other than your race and get away with it. At the same time, gun culture in the US was becoming irrational and nearly religious. School shootings had become ubiquitous. When in 2012, a young man massacred 20 elementary school students and 6 teachers at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut, and the obsession with gun ownership grew even more unhinged, it was clear that something insidious and ugly was at work in my country. Rather than recognize the danger to our children, the parents of the children of those killed at Sandy Hook were harassed by unhinged podcasters and right-wing media figures who insisted that the massacre was a hoax. The unimaginable pain these families were subjected to was horrifying, but it was also a sign, the beginning of a truly sinister deployment of misinformation and harassment to control the narrative of reality for political and financial gain. Even more lobbyist money from gun rights organizations poured into political campaigns. Members of Congress began wearing a tiny pin replica of an AR-15 automatic weapon on their lapels as they sat in the House and Senate chambers. In 2016, one of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court died unexpectedly of a heart attack. In our system, this meant, per the Constitution, that the then president, Barack Obama, was able to nominate a justice to serve on the Supreme Court, a justice who would be confirmed by the Senate, or if he was rejected or she was rejected by the Senate, the president would be free to select another nominee. But the Republican Party, led then by a senator from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell, then controlled the Senate and announced that the Senate would not even undertake the process of evaluating whoever President Obama selected. They didn't have a name. They wanted to hold that seat for the possible appointment of another conservative justice in the mold of Antonin Scalia, who had died. So they just refused to give President Obama's choice, Merrick Garland, who was then the chief judge of the court considered the most important and influential after the Supreme Court, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. They decided they would not give him a hearing and would not even meet with him. Now, Garland was not a liberal. He was a moderate. He had been a prosecutor in the Department of Justice for many years. Republicans in prior years had indicated that Garland was the kind of judge that if selected by a Democrat for a seat on the court, they would support. But now that he had been selected by the man who they had decided from the first day of his election was their arch nemesis, Barack Obama, they refused to give Merrick Garland a hearing. But there was something even more disturbing. At least 4 prominent, influential Republican senators made clear that even if Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, won the election in the fall, they would not provide a hearing for any candidate she selected to fill the open seat on the Supreme Court. They would, they promised, leave the seat open if necessary for 4 years and hope to regain the presidency at the subsequent presidential election, rather than allow a Democratic president to exercise their constitutional right to nominate a justice to fill that seat. This was a sign that the levers of our political system were broken. One political party, and I've only ever worked in the nonpartisan space in my life, so I don't come to you as a partisan. I have never worked for the Democratic Party, but I am a civil rights lawyer, and I do respect the rule of law, and I am a constitutional lawyer. And I know something that you all know and that you probably all have taught your children or you've taught very young people, which is that the rules of power are centered around the concept of taking turns. That's what elections are. You win the election, it's your turn. You lose the election, it's somebody else's turn. And an entire political party had decided that they weren't taking turns anymore. That even if they lost, they would withhold the ability of the person whose turn it was to exercise power. So this was very alarming and disturbing, But for me, it reminded me of something. It reminded me of how some Southern jurisdictions responded to the success of one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation in the history of our country, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in some places in the South, as Black voters began to be able to elect their candidates of choice to government, white leaders in those towns who had controlled all of the power took the drastic action to ensure that this would not change. In a place called Etowah County, Alabama, after a Black man was elected to the previously all-white county commission in the early 1980s, the commissioners by majority vote decided to change the kind of power exercised by each commissioner so that the ability of a commissioner to exercise independent sole power over the geographic area of his district was now scrapped in favor of all of those powers being held by the full commission and by majority vote. In Victoria, Texas, when the first Hispanic person was elected to the town commission, the majority white commission voted for a new rule. In order for an individual commissioner to place an item for discussion on the agenda, that commissioner would need a second vote. In this way, the new Hispanic commissioner was unable to bring before the commission the issues of profound concern to her community unless she could convince one of the recalcitrant white commissioners to support her desire to even put the issue on the agenda. In the early aughts in Kilmichael, Mississippi, when the latest census figures showed that Black citizens had become a majority of the voting age population in the town, the all-white town council simply decided to cancel elections and stayed in power, refusing to leave. Just 2 years ago, the mayor of New Bern, Alabama, was finally able to take office. He had been elected a few years before and was the first Black mayor of this very small town. But after his election, the incumbent white mayor and the all-white city council swore themselves back into office and locked the newly elected mayor out of the town hall. It was only after civil rights lawyers took up his case that finally, last year, he was able to take the position of mayor. In each of these instances, small Black and Hispanic communities were denied their turn. The white leaders who had long controlled power in those jurisdictions were simply unwilling to cede it. I'm saying all of this because if we're to talk about democracy, we need to first begin with an honest conversation about democracy in America. You know that American democracy has unraveled because you've seen the president engage in activities that are contrary to the rule of law. You have read reports of wide-scale corruption. You saw the images from January 6, 2001, when there was an attempt to overturn the results of the presidential election by force from individuals, many armed with guns, tasers, bear spray, knives, stun guns, who stormed the Capitol and brutally harmed police officers seeking to keep the building and the members of Congress who were inside safe. They menaced the Vice President of the United States and the Speaker of the House. And the Vice President had to flee. That's when you knew that American democracy was at the brink. But what of the Black residents in New Bern, Alabama, who voted for a new mayor, but who watched as that mayor was physically kept out of office for years? What of those who work 50 and 60 hours a week to make ends meet, but cannot afford to feed their families? Or those who waited 9 hours at the ballot box to vote in Fulton County, Georgia in 2020? What of the parents of 29 children killed in a school in Uvalde, Texas just a few years ago by a young man with an automatic weapon, while 150 state and local police officers and law enforcement officials, all armed, stood outside the school and classroom, too frightened to try and protect those children and their teachers? Where is the rule of law for the men and women, but mostly Black men and women, who you can read about online in newspapers every week in the US, including this week, who are at long last released from prison and exonerated after serving 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, upwards of 45 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit? Would their families and communities say they were living in a democracy just because President Obama was president or President Clinton was president? It's not about partisanship. This is about recognizing what is democracy and how deep does it flow. So we must begin by disabusing ourselves of the notion that the US democracy has only come into peril because of one man. Mr. Trump did not create the conditions that made his rise to power possible. He was simply and is an accelerant, working with the raw material that was already laid before him for exploitation. The book I'm writing is called Is This America? And I took the title of this book from a brief clip that I want to show you today that is from 1964, when a group of ordinary Black Mississippians who were locked out of the political process, kept from voting by the use of poll taxes, by the use of understandings clauses that required them to explain a portion of the Mississippi Constitution to the satisfaction of an election registrar. People who were beaten for simply trying to register to vote, decided that they would create their own party. And they created the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was open to people of every race. And they said, we will follow all the rules and we will create this party, we will pick a delegation and we will send this delegation, which complies with the United States Constitution because people of every race can participate. And we will challenge what they called the normal delegation of the Mississippi Democratic Party because that party does not follow the Constitution because it does not allow Black people to participate. And so they traveled to Atlantic City, where the Democratic National Convention was being held, and they sought to challenge and to appear before the Credentials Committee and tell them that the committee that you all have accepted is actually illegitimate because it was created in violation of the Constitution. They asked to be seated and they asked to address the Credentials Committee. The great voting rights activist, a woman, sharecropper, tenant farmer, who became aroused and activated when civil rights activists came to her town, Fannie Lou Hamer, was the person who spoke to that Credentials Committee. And I'll just play this short clip.
The seating of the delegation. The seating of the delegation from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party has political and moral significance far beyond the borders of Mississippi or the halls of this convention.
It is the very terror that these people are living through that is the reason that Negroes aren't voting, that they're kept out of the Democratic Party by the terror of the regular party. And what I want the Credentials Committee to hear is the terror which the regular party uses on the people of Mississippi, which is what Reverend King was explaining, which is what Aaron Henry was explaining, and which is what the next witness will explain, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Roosevelt, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stinney. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
Described the ways in which she had been brutally beaten when she left a voting rights meeting, the way she was dragged off the bus, she and her friends, and brutalized in prison. Is this America, she asked. Obviously, it was a rhetorical question. She was saying, this too is America. She was telling the august members of that Credentials Committee and the entire convention something about America that they either didn't know or didn't want to know. And this is what inspired me to write this book, Is This America? Because we all, I think, have been feeling the same, that we have crossed some kind of Rubicon and become a country that's not recognizable to itself. The reason I won't say that I'm not outraged, surprised in some ways at how far we have fallen, but the reason that I am expected that we would come to an impasse is because what we are seeing today is the culmination of the weakening of the institutions of democracy in our country. Democracies are not just made up of citizens who vote. Healthy democracies are undergirded by strong institutions, institutions that you all would recognize as essential to democracy: a strong press, strong political systems, strong pathways to vote, a strong public education system, all the things that hold a democracy together. And I would say in almost all of those measures, my country, the country that I love and that worked out for me, is horribly and dangerously compromised in terms of those institutions. The reason that I raise this is because there are many people who are, my colleagues, but who are desperate to bring America back to when it was great, back to when they feel that we were a democracy. And I worry about that because as I've tried to exemplify, as I've talked about my clients and places like New Bern, that is not a satisfactory space to think that democracy was healthy. Instead, we have to be thinking about how did we weaken ourselves to such a point that we could be taken advantage of. No one man can just come in and wreck a healthy democracy as quickly as has happened. And so the charge before us is to be honest about the unhealthiness of our democracy and to begin to think through how we can create a democracy that can withstand the inevitable winds that come against every democracy. My book is about the forces that I believe have weakened many of the most important pillars of our democracy. And the one that I know most about is race. It's racism and the accommodation of white supremacist ideology. It weakens our entire country. I talk about the civil rights movement as one of the most important democracy movements of the 20th century, because we often don't refer to it as a democracy movement. And as a result, we don't see the resistance to the civil rights movement, which continues to this day, as an anti-democracy movement. What that did was steer us away from all of the ways in which we stood to strengthen our democracy, to make us one people. The most powerful example for me is the disintegration of public life in our country. The late British historian Tony Judt theorized in his book, Ill Fares the Land, that a thick mesh of social interactions and public goods bind us together. The loss or privatization of those goods ultimately works, he argues, to dismantle the fabric of the state. He goes so far as to suggest that the shared experiences of relating to public authority and public policy incarnated in these services and benefits contributes mightily to a tauter sense of shared citizenship. Something that if you've ever, started a conversation with someone at the Motor Vehicle Bureau or on a subway platform when the trains are late, you know. But after Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 decision in which the Supreme Court said that segregated schools were unconstitutional, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended legal segregation in public accommodations, the concept of public life took a turn in the US. Many white people withdrew from public life, withdrew their children from public schools, left communities where Black people lived, left public services behind. Authors like Heather McGhee have beautifully described how rather than integrate public pools, they just closed them. Everyone knows the image of the two water fountains, colored and white. There's a reason that today, if you go through the country, you can barely find a water fountain in public, because they removed them rather than have one integrated water fountain. Zoos, public parks, all of this, because the Supreme Court said you have to share it on an equal basis. And so we have been siloed. The most important one is public schools, where you learn who you are as a citizen. Who were we talking with last night about the songs we learned as kids in elementary school? Freedom isn't free. All of the square dances and all of the crazy things that we had to learn together. It was citizenship development. It was giving us a sense that we, despite the fact I was in that first generation of children who were bused to schools for integration, despite the fact that we were so different, we were having these common experiences that suggested we were all Americans. And we treated each other that way. I had children in my class whose parents were from the Ukraine, were from Russia, were from Greece, were from Vietnam, but we were all together. That was a generation ago. That was actually just a 10-year period. From 1970 to 1980 was the highest period of racial integration in public schools in the United States. I graduated from high school in 1980. And then we went back. Today, schools are as, if not more, segregated than they ever were before Brown, and principally by choice. Schools are either Black schools or white schools. And so if you are developing a population, as Thurgood Marshall said, that can't go to school with each other, how can you ever expect that population to live with one another and to break down the things that separate us? When I was a kid growing up in New York, public facilities were what we had. You've already heard 10 kids in my family. We did not go on vacations. We went to state parks with hampers filled with sandwiches and Kool-Aid and fried chicken, and you came with your blankets, and just the act of being in a public park, right? You have to figure out how to make sure your blanket is not too close to the people next to you. You smell the foods that other people are eating, and you see them playing games that you know nothing about. Just that experience helps us to see one another and recognize the multiple ways in which we can be American. But now the word public in the United States has been racialized. If I say public schools to anyone who's American, there's an image in your head of what public schools are. If I say public transportation, and the reason why outside of our major metropolitan areas, public transportation is not supported, people will pay any amount of tax for new highways, but they won't for public transportation, because public transportation is seen as helping those people. You may be seeing the controversies about public libraries. All of these places where we get to interact with one another and experience common citizenship have broken down. And the reason that they broke down was because of racism and lingering white supremacist ideology. The rule of law, which everyone would agree is essential for healthy democracy, yes, it has been under threat lately, but the rule of law has been under threat for a long time. There have been two systems of justice in our country for a very long time. And most people know it. If you are Black or poor, you are likely to face a different justice system than if you are wealthy and white. And you know this, you've seen the videos, whether it's police encounters, arrest, prosecution, the framing of what constitutes drug crimes, jury awards in civil cases, strategic removal of Black jurors from hearing certain cases, the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, witness credibility, sentencing, or the imposition of the death penalty. Race is ever present in our justice system. You cannot tell me that, oh, now we have a two-tiered justice system. It has been that way. So, before the US, we have a great challenge. One of the challenges is to recognize the ways in which our current moment was very much created by the ability of one man whose particular talent is to identify the weakness in those he's trying to control. And he recognized the weaknesses in our political system. He recognized the thread and the river of racism and white supremacy that still runs through the United States. He came on the scene with his demand that President Obama provide proof of his birth certificate, questioning the legitimacy and the Americanness of a Black person is as old as the hills. And this barely coded racial challenge was not accidental. It was a call to arms. And he grew ever more emboldened by it in his explicitly white supremacist platform, such that today you can hardly read an executive order that does not find some way to serve up the fresh meat of racism to his base, framed as DEI, of course, but very apparent. So those of us who had been engaging with America in its meanest places were not surprised. What surprised many of us, and I will confess this, was how many of my fellow Americans, not poor Americans, rich, middle class, poor, yes, how many had grown impatient with the norms and ethics we had developed in the post-civil rights movement period to aid us in becoming a true multiracial democracy. From civil rights laws outlawing discrimination in housing, public accommodations, voting, to words that we refrain from saying so as not to offend, to deliberately work to create racial and gender diverse environments and universities in corporate America and in workplaces. But this new person on the scene correctly recognized that many white Americans wanted to be released from the post-civil rights movement norms that we had developed. They wanted the freedom to offend, the freedom even to be their worst selves. It was liberating, apparently, but there's a cost. And the point of my book is that the cost is not just to racial minorities, as we now can see. It's to the integrity of democracy itself. The embrace of equality has always made American democracy stronger. And whenever it has been rejected, we have moved towards fracture and authoritarianism. The one thing that fractured our country fully in half and broke it was the question of slavery. And after the Civil War, the people charged with stitching together the country and creating a new country did so. And they did so through 3 amendments to our Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, in America, if I ask someone about their First Amendment rights, they will tell me what they are. So often they're wrong, but they have a sense of what their First Amendment rights are. If I ask about their Second Amendment rights, they have a sense of their Second Amendment rights. Some even have a sense of their Fourth Amendment rights. They know. You'll say even jokingly, I plead the Fifth, which is the right not to incriminate myself. Right? People get it, but you very rarely hear those Reconstruction amendments discussed, and they are. Certainly the 14th Amendment, in the words of Eric Foner, the most consequential addition to our Constitution after the Bill of Rights. What does the 14th Amendment to the Constitution do? Well, the 13th Amendment ended slavery and abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment was the centerpiece of the thing. The 14th Amendment, the first line, guaranteed birthright citizenship. Any person born or naturalized in the United States shall be a citizen of the United States and of the state in which they reside. And the purpose of that was very particular. It was to ensure that all Black people, formerly enslaved and free, would be citizens, because the Supreme Court had said several years before that Black people could never be citizens of the United States. And to remove what they called caste or caste from citizenship, that there would be no tiers of citizenship. Very powerful birthright citizenship. Tens of millions of European immigrants were the biggest beneficiaries of it. People came to the United States and they knew that they could be naturalized and be citizens. And they knew that even if they gave birth to a child the day after they arrived at Ellis Island, that child was American. Powerful, meant to deal with the 4 million Black people, but tens of millions of Europeans. When people say America's a nation of immigrants, that's what they owe it to. That first line of the 14th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment did something else really powerful and important. It shifted the national identity. The identity of the country that had been built on the concept of freedom and liberty now had a third thing added to it, and that was equality. And a fourth, justice. The word equal does not appear in our Constitution before the 14th Amendment. To the extent you're thinking of America as a place of equality and justice, that only happened after the Civil War. That only happened after the battle over slavery. And if you think that the United States is a place of equality, and that equality surely was in our Constitution and on the minds of our founding fathers, you are incorrect. Because our first Constitution said that Black people could be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of constitutional or congressional representation. The first Constitution said that the country could participate in the international slave trade until 1808. There's nothing about equality that was in there. What people are often thinking about is the Declaration of Independence, which said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And what the 14th Amendment does is reach back over the first Constitution to pull that promise of the Declaration into our foundational documents. It's huge. It's hugely powerful. And so to the extent you think of America as a place of equality, or at least the promise of equality, it came at the cost of addressing this issue of the enslavement of Black people in our country. The civil rights movement also benefited the full country. As a matter of fact, we used to know this. This is why President Eisenhower called out the 101st Airborne to escort Black children into high school in Little Rock, Alabama. He did it because the images of crowds pushing against these children, he thought, was ruining America's reputation during the Cold War. That African countries were seeing this, that Russia was using it to tell those African countries, you see how America treats people like you? John Kennedy had the same experience. He was not a flaming civil rights advocate when he came into office. But when diplomats who were visiting the United States, who were stationed at the UN, couldn't be accommodated, that is, when Black diplomats from Africa came and hotels would not allow them to stay there and restaurants wouldn't serve them, it also became an international embarrassment. Papers all over Africa talked about the treatment of their diplomats. And so he begged the restaurant industry and the housing industry, can you at least stand this down because it's embarrassing us? So America's stature in the world, when these barriers were removed, grew. And that's why you think that America is this wonderful shining light. A very pragmatic response. But every time we open the door to greater equality, greater justice, the whole country benefits. And the idea that somehow civil rights is spoils for Black people or for women or for Hispanic people is just untrue. We make our country better. But unfortunately, we don't want to deal with this thing that lives in our national DNA, which is racism and white supremacy, and I'll close with this. How many people have heart disease in their family? Okay, I get it, you don't want to tell people. And also, you all are very healthy here in Germany. Diabetes, cancer. You got something. Okay. And when you know that thing that's in your DNA, you do something. You do different things. If your mom died of breast cancer, as mine did, you don't miss your mammograms. Like, you are on it from the time, whatever is the age, 40, that they tell you to start taking it, you start doing it. If alcoholism runs in your family, you're conscious. It's not that you don't drink, but you're conscious of it, right? If heart disease runs in your family, you may exercise, you may try to keep your cholesterol down, you'll change your diet, you'll do things to protect against the worst manifestation of that thing that lives in your DNA. You're not mad at your DNA. You're not like, oh my God, let's stop talking about our DNA. Why do we have to keep talking about it? You don't say that. You actually want to know. You want the information because it allows you to protect against it. Well, nations also have DNA. And I think Germany has tried to address some of that. That the stumbling over all of the markers, all over this city about where there were different concentration camps and workhouses is an effort to respond and to say we want to inoculate ourselves. Like, we don't want to forget because we want to inoculate ourselves against this thing. That is not how we do it in America. The way we do it in America is that we say, people who are civil rights advocates and so forth, say we should talk about this. And most white people say, do we have to? And I always say, well, you're tired of talking about it? When were you talking about it? Like, how are you tired? But everyone's exhausted with the idea of talking about race, and we really don't talk about it. And as a result, we have allowed the infrastructure, the health regimen designed to protect us against this corrosive thing in our DNA that actually fractured our country. We have allowed those things to unravel. And so the pullout from the public school system, the desire to do away with inclusion and the language of inclusion, the desire to demonize people in particular kinds of ways, was left on the table available for someone just cunning and opportunistic enough to make that appeal. And that appeal was evident from 2015, unless you didn't want to see it. That was the way in. And that's why it's such a weakness in our country, because you can put anything on the wings of white supremacist ideology and be sure it'll fly somewhere. It's the gateway drug of authoritarianism. And that's true whether it's in the United States or anywhere in the world. And so the book I'm writing is because most of the people who are experts who talk about the rise of authoritarianism do not talk about race in my country. And I don't know why, because the entire South was essentially a series of authoritarian governments until the 1960s. I love when people say, well, we should really look at Poland, and I think that's great. But we actually have our own experience with overcoming authoritarian governments. And the conversation, therefore, never includes this powerful and important subject, mostly because the people who are deemed to be the experts know very little about race and about our history. So I wanted to enter this conversation by suggesting that those of us who really want the best for our country and for the world, because on the reputation of being this place of equality and justice and the shining city on the hill and all the accumulated things that have given America not just financial and military power, but narrative power in the, idea. America is an idea as well as a country. And all of that power came, much of it, as a consequence of these struggles. And yet somehow we leave it out of the conversation. And I mean to suggest to people that if you really care, if you care about my country, and if you care about the world, because America is so powerful, then you're going to have to marshal the courage. You know when you don't want to go to the doctor because you don't want to know? Marshal the courage to confront what is in our national DNA and help us, link arms with us to inoculate our country against it. We won't end it. My job as a civil rights lawyer is not to end racism. My job is to try and help create the structures that will protect us against its worst manifestation. And I do it for my country, for the world, for my children, for my grandson, but also for yours. Thank you.
Sherrilyn, thank you for, is this on? An amazing and incredibly powerful set of remarks. Thank you so much. We don't have all that much time. I'd almost want to send you back to do more. But I'll ask one or two questions and then we'll open it up very quickly. I completely agree with you about the fact that whether the country seemed like it was flourishing and headed in the right direction or was dealing with its worst demons, there was always a lot of ugliness in our national life. But I think one of the paradoxes that struck so many of us is that we felt in 2008, 2009, that with the election of an African-American president, we had reached a place that none of us had ever thought we were going to reach, and that we had not banished our demons, but we had perhaps put the worst of them behind. And I think many of us have still never recovered from the shock of Election Day in 2016 to find out that we didn't know our own country. So I'm curious how you think about that transition from a period of enormous exuberance in America, 2009, 2010, so on and so forth, and the re-election in 2012.
Well, yeah. I think a lot of us wanted to believe that, but many of us knew it wasn't true. For a variety of reasons. You know, if you ever have decided you're going to get fit, physically fit, when you go to the gym all the time, you're doing it. It's fantastic. You feel great. You look great. Who would ever stop this when it's obviously a benefit to you? And then at some point, it was really late and you had a big piece of pie and you wake up the next morning and you don't feel like going to the gym. And then you stop going to the gym, right? It isn't because you didn't think going to the gym was good for you. You just kind of fell off the wagon, as they say. And I think this has been true of the US. This is why I talk about a regimen, that it is not something, we have turned the conversation about race into feelings, into it's whether you're a nice person or not a nice person, whether you see race or don't see race. And I'm completely not interested in the feelings. I'm interested in the structure. Therefore, one man who is incredibly talented, handsome, incredibly brilliant, supple intelligence, well-spoken, funny, all the things that you could hope for, gets elected is not really the question. And America was deeply vulnerable in that moment. We had the financial collapse. People were disillusioned after the Iraq War. There was a lot of vulnerability in the country that made that moment possible. But don't forget that no sooner was he inaugurated than the next day, the opposing party met and decided that they would work to make sure that he was not successful, which I don't think has happened before. Usually people say, well, I want the president to be successful. No, they were quite unabashed that they did not want him to be successful. So things were already clear. And then you'll remember it took maybe another month, a whole movement rose up against the president called the Tea Party. And these folks put on tricorn hats and they had flutes and they were celebrating the founders, they said. And they were in revolt, all because the president wanted to do, oh my goodness, pass legislation that would provide health care. That was enough to produce a whole movement of people who, in barely veiled racial terms and sometimes not veiled at all, had risen up against the president's agenda. That's 2009. So he was elected in 2008. So 2008 was a year, terrible financial collapse. Amazing person comes on the scene, gets elected. America always deeply torn about women. That's the alternative, right? So I think some of us mistakenly read too much into it. And given the level of resistance that he faced almost immediately and quite irrationally, it was very apparent that this was not something deeper.
So we thought we were on a pinnacle and we were really on a precipice.
For sure. I think so. I think there was a backlash, for sure.
There certainly was a backlash. So I'm just going to ask one more question, then we'll open it up. We do a lot of programming here at the Academy on democracy. And the word that comes up most in terms of the causes of the current crisis is one that you mentioned as well, which is inequality. And I'm wondering if you would just say a few words about the relationship between inequality and racism.
Yeah, sure. Goodness. Let me see how I can truncate this. And it actually connects with my conversation about public life. America was not always, and white Americans were not always resistant to the idea of public goods. When public goods were white, they were actually essential to providing a leg up to many white families. Our entire interstate highway system, which was built in the 1950s after President Eisenhower had been here in Germany and he'd seen the Autobahn and he said, we can do that, was fantastic. You know, it was so important. But the purpose of all these highways was to help create a white middle class and to allow the suburbs to develop, which you would need a car to get to. The GI Bill, which provided our veterans with money for education, money for housing and jobs, was not the same for Black and white veterans. What you could do as a white veteran seeking to go to university, where you could go was completely different in 1949 than where a Black person could go with their GI Bill. The neighborhood you could move into for your housing, your ability to buy a house that might appreciate in value, was very different than the neighborhoods that were cordoned off for Black people by the federal government. When the federal government started insuring home loans in the 1930s, they did so using maps that designated which communities were deserving of getting mortgage insurance. And if you've heard the phrase redlining, that's because Black communities were, by the federal government, colored in red. And if you looked at the legend, I have one of them, it says dangerous or hazardous, hazardous, hazardous. And then the white community would be in blue and it would say best, right? And the federal government also provided samples of what we call racially restrictive covenants that would be placed in housing deeds that would say the house could not be passed to someone who was Jewish or Black. These are things that came from the federal government. So when we talk about inequality, and people say, well, that was the past. Okay, but if I could buy a house in a prosperous neighborhood in Chicago, in New York, anywhere, and then I could pass that house on to my child, who maybe then sells that house at an enormous profit, I am now bringing generational wealth to my family. But the truth instead is that while most white families, when the patriarch and matriarch die, inherit wealth, most Black families inherit debt. So the idea of generational wealth, which is something the United States is premised on, that's why everybody wants to buy a house. That's supposed to be your means of accumulating wealth. Well, the deed has already been stacked, because the house your grandparents were able to get is not the house my grandparents were able to get. And so when my father died, for example, we just called it a day, right? We weren't going to make anything, but there was nothing to be had because of the neighborhood that we were forced to live in. So that wealth inequality continues. We also have had complete, exponential tax policies that have benefited the extremely wealthy, as I suggested earlier. The fact that we don't support public goods is a big deal. When I was a kid, I grew up in New York, so it's not the same, but I had a 35-cent token, and from Queens, right? I had to pay for that terrible Q6 bus, so maybe it's 2 tokens. But then I could get on the subway and I could make it all the way to my job on 3 different trains on that 35 cents. In Baltimore, where I now live, a significantly smaller city, it should take me no time to go across town. But instead, it takes like an hour on the bus, because there is no rapid transit that goes east to west in Baltimore, which is where most Black people live in the city. And why don't we have that rapid transit rapid transit system? Because white families protested having the kind of public transportation system that they thought would bring Black people into their neighborhood. So we have all of these things that are embedded in the history that affect what your economic circumstance is today. And when we then remove the safety net of all of these public goods, we create a circumstance where it's just survival of the fittest.
Questions? Right here, please.
Thank you. That was great. My name is Ann Wertheimer auf Deutsch, and I'm chair of American Voices Abroad Berlin. we sponsor the No Kings demonstrations. One's coming up on March 28th, right here, Solidarity. I wanted to ask you what you actually think about mass demonstrations now. We saw them during the civil rights era. We saw women's marches. And now we've seen 2 No Kings marches. What do you think?
I think that resistance is an ecosystem. And I think I know in Europe, you all are great. Your marches are amazing. We look at them all the time and we're like, oh my God, they're all out there. It's so fantastic. And not so much in the United States. And I too would love it to be more. But I also am very much aware that resistance is an ecosystem. Although there are many elements of my profession, the law profession, that have shamed themselves in this period, there are many that have been superb and exceptional and have done an incredible job of slowing down the worst excesses that we have seen. All the stories that we know about those excesses come out of litigation. The courage of district court judges who are doing their part and telling the truth about what they're learning in these cases is incredibly important. The boycotts of different brands, there's one happening right now, Resist and what do you call it when you get rid of a social media platform or something? Resist and however you get rid of that thing on your phone. That's actually, has gained a lot of traction, and this is really about the big tech companies. We should remember that about the civil rights movement as well. We should remember that it was, we started with the Montgomery bus boycott. The purpose of the Montgomery bus boycott was to not require Black people to sit in the back of the bus and give up their seats for white people. The purpose of the Montgomery bus boycott was not the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It grew organically into becoming something much bigger. I think because there has been I guess I should just, say this truthfully, there's tremendous fear in the country. And I don't think the fear is unwarranted. There is tremendous exhaustion in the country. The very people that we want to come out and mass march are the people who were mass marching from 2016 to 2020 about police violence and truly believed we were going to get legislation, and then we didn't. So they're tired. The people who, organized and worked so hard to turn out the vote in 2024 and the election did not turn out as they expected are exhausted. And then there are the people who are afraid, who very appropriately have evaluated this administration and believe that it's important for them to be strategic about when they decide to do that. I'm kind of heartened because I'm kind of tired of the usual suspects idea of how democracy gets saved in America. It really does have to be everyone. And I think Minnesota is a turning point for that reason. It is in the middle of the country. It is super white, and they are doing something that I actually think, Ms. Wertheimer, is even more important in this moment. I hate to say this, but we've been groomed by this administration. This is 2.0. We're not the same people we were in 2014, 15. We have seen so many things. We have heard so many words out of the mouths of high-ranking officials. We have seen people made fun of. We have heard the degradation. We've seen, when I was growing up, you didn't see people murdered, but our kids have seen it. They were seeing it with the police videos. They're seeing it in Minneapolis. And so there's a way in which what I have worried about is that we have grown accustomed to a level of violence and cruelty that we had not experienced before. And what I think is happening right now, in Minneapolis especially, but also in Chicago and Los Angeles before that, is something we need very desperately, which is a reawakening of our empathy. If we are going to be successful, We have to feel again. And we had to numb ourselves just to like deal. And so I think, you know, when the photograph of a little boy with a little winter hat on, right, can arouse the country again. We used to have that, you know. On Bloody Sunday in 1965, when there was the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and you know the protesters were all beaten. Between that date in March and August, that was how long it took to get the Voting Rights Act. It's really short. And why? Because people responded to the images they saw that Sunday night on TV when, during the first network premiere showing of the film Judgment at Nuremberg, CBS broke in with breaking news, which now happens, you know, every 5 minutes. But then when news was breaking, it was really important. And they said, we're going to bring you images from Alabama. And they showed these images of state troopers beating these unarmed people who were just walking in solidarity for voting rights at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it aroused such a passion in people who were just watching this movie, Judgment at Nuremberg, and now watching these images had to figure out, well, who are we? Which side are we on? Right? That's March. By August, we have the most important piece of civil rights legislation ever to pass in this country. And so that empathy piece is really important, and they know it too. That's why we have laws now that have said you cannot teach history, you cannot teach slavery, you cannot teach any subject that might cause children to feel, what is the word they use? Shame or anxiety on account of race. Because what they saw in 2020, when people all over the country, the largest civil rights marches this country has ever seen was after George Floyd was killed. In all 50 states. Civil rights movement was the 1% of the 1%. George Floyd was 50 states and around the world. And that was because that 9 minutes, empathy. Wasn't that police hadn't killed other Black people, but you could not watch that video without having your empathy woken up. And so they set about, it came quickly right after that, the first laws banning books and deciding that you couldn't teach subjects that might create that empathy. And empathy is powerful. I remember reading the Diary of Anne Frank in 6th grade. Couldn't put it down, you know, brought it down to the breakfast table. And I think I felt shame and guilt, not because I did anything, but just as a human being. When I read Of Mice and Men, I don't think I'd ever thought about intellectually disabled people before. But reading that novel aroused my empathy. That's actually how we teach children empathy. And so they want to cut that off because they saw their children going out to those marches as a response to empathy. So when I see Minnesota, I feel good about it. I feel good about it because it's ordinary people who are deciding what it means to be someone's neighbor, deciding what it means to protect your community. And they are reteaching us to be able to act on that empathy. And so I think the day will come, and soon, when the marches will get bigger and bigger because it's going very fast. It's going very, very fast. And so I don't really worry about it. I think it will come as it is supposed to come.
So we don't have time for another question, but I'm going to allow one anyway. So was there one more back there?
Thank you very much. My name is Katrin Völkner, and I was wondering if you could share some strategies with us that you would like to see put in place to deal with white supremacy and to look racism in the eyes. And yeah, if you have some examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to be able to create spaces in where, you know, I'm very comfortable talking about racism because it's what I do. I understand that many people are not comfortable talking about racism. It's not comfortable to talk about because we never want to talk about the ugliest parts of ourselves or our society. So I don't think there's anything to be gleaned from the fact that it makes people uncomfortable. But I do think that if we begin to think of it as a phenomenon, you know, I use that DNA example, we take some of the emotion out of the personal implication out of thinking about how we have to deal with this thing. And if we begin to talk about racism in a way that I'm trying to talk about it as a threat to democracy, not as a threat to Black people. I mean, it is that, or brown people, or women. It is a threat to democracy. So while we're currently having this conversation about democracy, all I'm saying is that's got to be on the table. And at your peril, you can keep it off the table, but then you're just buying a little bit of time, just like we bought 4 years in 2020 when Joe Biden was elected. And I've even said that if Kamala Harris had been elected in 2024, then everyone would think, you see, just like they did with Obama, you see, we don't have this problem anymore. We're great. We've overcome. And it wouldn't have been true. We've just been buying these little snippets of time. So the first strategy for me is to begin to understand, as I've been sharing with you, the structural elements of racism. That's when I talk about systemic racism, that's what we mean. I don't mean that you personally did anything. What, were you not supposed to inherit the house from your parents? You did inherit the house. I'm just explaining to you structurally, your parents didn't do anything. The federal government told them, this is the deed this is what you have to put in your housing deed. They were not supposed to take the mortgage insurance. So that's why it's important to talk about the structures that perpetuate this phenomenon and that continue to perpetuate this phenomenon. And I think that is the way in for people to understand, because what we need is to break down the structures that do it. And then if we know about the structures of the past, figure out how we reconcile those structures with our contemporary policy, not just identify like who are the bad people, and it's a structural question. And to begin to understand racism in the context of wealth transfer and not feelings. I mean, right back to slavery, the kidnapping, trafficking, and holding people in bondage was for the purpose of wealth transfer. Transfer from the continent of Africa, wealth. Transfer from Black bodies, wealth, right? It's not about feelings, whether you're a nice person. Who holds somebody in slavery? Like, that's crazy. You do it because you're getting something for free from that person. You're extracting. It's an extractive industry. And so if we begin to get out of the whether you're a nice person, and people say to me all the time, I don't even see race. I don't know how you can not see race. I mean, I do. So it doesn't mean you're racist because you see race. In fact, if you're telling me you don't see race, I'm a little worried. You're trying a little too hard, right? Of course we see race, right? It's what you do once you've seen it that is the question that answers the question about whether you're racist or not. And so I just think there's a very personal conversation. It's very frustrating. And the conversation is systemic because we're citizens in the business of creating and sustaining a healthy democracy. And it really does go to what is required of responsible citizens in a democracy. What must we know? What must we do? How must we prepare and fight? Because as Anna said, democracy is not self-sustaining, it's work. And I can tell you straight up, in the United States, people treat democracy like we just thought it came in a box, and then you opened it up and we have democracy, and then that's it. We didn't understand that it has to be tenderly nurtured. And I'll just say this last thing because I know we're out of time. I would say particularly in the United States, I think that what we are trying to accomplish is insane and also beautiful, right? It is a humongous country from ocean to ocean with different terrain, with different regions, with different culture, language. We don't have a common historical story. I know people say, well, you got to speak English. My husband knows this. There was a period where we live in Baltimore, there was a period where everyone who had any power spoke German, right? We don't even have that kind of commonality in our history. We don't have a common religion, no matter what Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance say. We don't. And so we don't have those things that hold many European countries together, where you just have a culture that's the same that you could. We don't have that. We're made up of all these different elements. And that means that the structures that we need to bring us together are even more intense than the structures that you may need. That's why I talk about the dissolution of public life. We actually have to be with each other to even get it, because we don't have the kind of commonalities that other older countries have. And so for me, one of the things I say all the time is that the United States could not be called a democracy until at least 1954. Because either we had slavery or half the country was under legal apartheid. We did not call apartheid South Africa a democracy. That's what happened. I know it feels uncomfortable, but it's the truth. Some people say not till 1965, but at least until 1954. And that means we are a very young democracy. What's that, like 72 years? That's not long. So I'm kind of patient with us because we haven't been at it. We've been a nation, but a democracy? Not for very long. So my hope is that in the second part of my book, I'm just talking about a rebranding of what it means to be a citizen in a democracy. It's not just that you go vote, which too many people say it's all about voting. It's actually not all about voting. It's about voting and many other things that make you a citizen, a responsible citizen in a democracy. And I think the time has come for us to kind of reimagine what is required of us if we hope to live in a democracy.